Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about what's happening in the economy in Venezuela. And just in case you're sitting there thinking, Venezuela? Really? Does anybody care about Venezuela? I think it's actually a really important country in terms of what's happening in the globe right now. Because Venezuela is sitting on an enormous amount of oil. In fact, it's got the largest oil reserves of any country in the world. Over 300 billion barrels. Which means that it's got more than 8 times the amount of oil that the USA has, and around 4 times that of Russia. And if you follow the channel, you'll know that we've talked about Russia a lot over the last couple of years. And Russia is an oil powerhouse. So the fact that Venezuela has around 4 times more oil should mean that it's one of the richest countries in the world. But unfortunately, it isn't, as a result of a number of factors. Firstly, back in the 1970s, Venezuela took the not very smart decision to nationalise all of the oil industry. So at that point, a lot of majors had come over to Venezuela and set up drilling rigs and were doing very well. And they were producing around 3.5 million barrels of oil per day back in the 1960s. However, Venezuela decided that that arrangement wasn't working for them in terms of their communist ideology. And so they nationalised 60% of the industry. And as a result of that, a lot of companies decided that they no longer wanted to invest into Venezuela. And over the last 50 years, we have seen a huge reduction in terms of Venezuela's output as a result of the fact that companies are no longer pouring tens of billions of dollars into the infrastructure to get that oil out of the ground. But alongside those problems, Venezuela also shot itself in the foot in terms of what it's doing in terms of humanitarian issues. And the election that was held in 2018, which re-elected the current President Nicolas Maduro. Now, the USA said that that election was rigged, and as a result of those accusations, it applied financial and oil trading sanctions against Venezuela. And as a result of that, Venezuela has struggled to be able to find export markets. And so the combination of the lack of investment into production and the lack of availability of buyers has led to a huge reduction in Venezuela's oil industry. Now, interestingly, around 6 months ago, the USA decided to take its foot off the gas and release some of those sanctions, as long as Venezuela agreed that it was going to have a clear and open election process for the election that's due in 2024. However, unfortunately, the USA isn't happy with the way the election process is being managed, and so the sanctions have now been put back into place. And obviously, this represents seriously bad news from Venezuela's point of view. So in today's video, I'll have a look at what's going on right now with regards to oil production and exports from Venezuela's point of view. We'll talk about the sanctions that were lifted and have now been reapplied by the USA against Venezuela and what the implications of this are for the Venezuelan economy. We'll talk about what's going on with the election process and what's likely to happen in terms of that election later this year. And then finally today, I'll wrap up with my summary as to what I think the implications of the current situation are for the Venezuelan economy and what's likely to happen over the course of the next 3 to 6 months. But before we get started on all of that, I'd like to say thank you so much to everyone that's supporting the channel. If you've bought me a coffee or sent me a YouTube super thanks, thank you for the time and effort that you've taken to do that. Really, really appreciate it. And if you've signed up as a long-term supporter, either through Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee membership or YouTube membership, thank you for that long-term support. Really keeps me going, keeps me motivated, and keeps me making more videos. So thank you so much. Venezuela is located at the northern end of South America, occupies a roughly triangular area that is larger than the combined areas of France and Germany, and has a current population of around 28 million people. The country is bounded by both the Caribbean Sea and the Atlantic Ocean to the north, Guyana to the east, Brazil to the south, and Colombia to the southwest and west. The capital of Venezuela is Caracas, which is the primary centre of industry, commerce, education and tourism. As mentioned at the start of the video, Venezuela is blessed with natural resources and has the largest oil supplies of any country in the world, and alongside its oil reserves, it also has significant amounts of natural gas and coal. Prior to the development of the oil industry, agriculture, fishing and forestry were central to the Venezuelan economy and produced more than half of its GDP. Venezuela's main cash crop is coffee, and its staple food crops are corn or maize and rice. This chart shows the countries with the largest oil reserves in the world, and the scale of the countries on this map are shown by the size of their oil reserves. They're obviously not to scale, because if they were, Venezuela would be the biggest country in the world. And what this chart shows is that Venezuela, with 300 billion barrels of oil under the ground, has the largest reserves, followed by Saudi Arabia with 267 billion barrels, Canada with just under 170 billion, Iran is number 4 with 158 billion, Iraq number 5 with 142 billion, Kuwait is number 6 with 101 billion, United Arab Emirates number 7 with 98 billion. Russia is only ranked as the 8th country in the world in terms of its oil reserves with 80 billion barrels. Libya is number 9 with 48 billion. Nigeria is number 10 with 37 billion, closely followed by the USA at number 11 with just under 37 billion. Kazakhstan is number 12 with 30 billion. China number 13 with 26 billion. Qatar 14 with 25 billion. And Brazil is number 15 with 12.7 billion. And this table shows the countries with the highest oil production in 2023. And what this shows is that the United States, despite not being in the top 10 in terms of reserves, was the largest oil producer, producing over 13 million barrels of oil per day. Russia was number 2, producing over 10 million barrels. Saudi Arabia 3 with just under 9 million barrels per day. Canada number 4 with just under 5 million barrels per day. Iraq was number 5. China 6. Iran number 7. Brazil was 8th. United Arab Emirates was 9th, and Kuwait was the 10th largest producer of oil in 2023. And in terms of answering the question as to where is Venezuela on this list, they're not in the top 10, they're not actually even in the top 20. They were the 21st largest producer of oil in 2023. And when you compare that to the reserves that Venezuela has, there is a total mismatch here. And one of the reasons for that is that it is very expensive to set up oil drilling facilities. Setting up an oil drilling facility is a major capital investment and involves lots of people and equipment, and that equipment can be moved all around the world. So if you decide that you don't want to continue drilling oil in Venezuela, you can actually take your rig and move it somewhere else, particularly if it's a water-based facility. And in 2023, the cost of renting an oil drilling facility rose to around $500,000 per day. Now obviously that cost only relates to the capital equipment. You also need to man it and have lots of facilities around that rig. So the cost of drilling oil can be around $1 million per day. So this is a large commitment from an oil company's perspective. And Venezuela is suffering because all of the major companies decided that as a result of the combination of the nationalization of the industry and also the sanctions preventing the sale of Venezuelan oil, they wanted to move all of their investment to other countries. And to show the impact of the sanctions that have been applied against Venezuela since 2014, this chart shows the total number of drilling rigs in the country. In April 2014, it was recorded that there were 64 operational drilling rigs, and this figure actually increased to 79 by August 2014. However, as the first round of sanctions started to be applied against Venezuela, companies started pulling out of the country, and by July 2016 the total number of rigs had fallen to 49. That fell further to 40 in November 2017, reduced to 20 by April 2019 when an additional round of sanctions were applied against Venezuela, and by June 2020 there were no operational drilling rigs in Venezuela. Now that situation has improved over the last 6 months and there are currently 3 operational rigs. However, this chart really shows you the scale of the problem in Venezuela because overseas companies are not prepared to commit huge amounts of capital and people and long-term support to Venezuela because they really don't know what the future holds. And therefore the only oil that's being produced in Venezuela right now is being produced by the state-owned company PDVSA. This chart shows Venezuela's crude oil production per day dating back to the late 1930s. And what this shows is that in the period between the early 1940s and the late 1960s, there was a boom in Venezuelan oil, and the number of barrels of oil being produced per day actually increased to more than 3.5 million, making Venezuela one of the largest producers of oil back in the 1960s. However, as a result of the intervention of the communist government in Venezuela, in the 70s and 80s, oil production fell significantly and hit a low of around 1.5 million barrels per day in the mid-1980s. In the 1990s, there was a recovery in the industry, and production rose to above 3 million barrels per day by the end of the decade, as a result of heavy investment that was made by the Venezuelan state. However, as oil prices started to fall and problems started to emerge in the Venezuelan economy, production fell back down below 2.5 million barrels. It briefly recovered in 2012 and 2013. However, in 2014, Venezuela started to be hit by sanctions, and we saw a massive reduction in production as companies decided that they wanted to exit Venezuela and stopped investing anything into their drilling activities. And as you can see, as a result of that, production fell off a cliff and reached a low of around 500,000 barrels in 2020. Now, over the last couple of years, there has been a slight bounce back, and in 2023, production hit a high of 700,000 barrels as a result of the lifting of the US sanctions. However, the reimposement of these sanctions is now going to cause further problems for Venezuela, as it's going to struggle to get outside investment from oil majors, and therefore it's likely that oil production will fall back again. And to put the impact of these movements in oil production into perspective, this chart shows Venezuela's gross domestic product dating back to 1986, and Venezuela is entirely dependent on oil exports to achieve increases in its GDP. And what we can see here is that between 1986 and 2001, there was a gradual increase in GDP. We then saw a fall for a couple of years as oil prices started to suffer. However, between 2003 and 2013, there was a huge increase in GDP in Venezuela as the oil industry was booming. But the impact of the sanctions that Venezuela has faced over the last 10 years has devastated GDP in Venezuela, and it fell from a high of around $373 billion in 2012 to a low of $44 billion in 2020. And the GDP figure for 2023 of $92 billion equates to where Venezuela was back in 1998. So you can see that it's no longer benefiting from all of the major oil reserves that it's sitting upon.
The US is reimposing oil sanctions on Venezuela. Washington officials say they won't renew a license due to expire early Thursday, which had broadly eased restrictions. Hours before the deadline, the US Treasury Department issued a new license, giving firms 45 days to wind down oil and gas operations in the country. It all comes after Venezuela President Nicolas Maduro failed to honour all terms in the deal that had eased sanctions. The US says he's breached a promise to allow the opposition to run a candidate of its choice in July's presidential election. However, the news of renewed sanctions drew a defiant response from the Venezuelan leader.
When did we become a gringo colony, a star of the United States? When? Can someone tell me? Venezuela is a country that walks on its own feet, uses its own head, produces with its own hands.
Government supporters insist Venezuela has honoured the deal with the US. But Washington says Maduro has harassed, intimidated or detained opponents. Multiple opposition allies and activists have faced arrest in recent months. Opposition leader Maria Corina Machado condemned the government's actions.
The regime violated every agreement. They haven't complied with everything they promised. Instead, they've intensified repression. They've incarcerated more people. They've persecuted, they've barred opposition members, everything they said they wouldn't do.
The next Venezuelan presidential election is set for July the 28th, 2024. And this is 6 years on from the previous election that caused so many problems for the country. Nicolas Maduro was voted back into power in 2018. However, the USA and the European Union and a lot of other countries accused Venezuela of rigging that election, saying that it wasn't a fair vote and that Nicolas Maduro basically was voted back into power because nobody was actually allowed to vote for any of the opposition. And that's the reason why the sanctions have been applied against Venezuela. And that's the problem that Venezuela is still facing now, because the reason that the USA relaxed those sanctions was because Maduro agreed to have a fair and open election in 2024. However, he hasn't really stood by that promise, and as a result of that, the USA have now reimposed those sanctions. In 2023, the opposition parties in Venezuela held a multi-candidate vote to see who was going to stand against Nicolas Maduro, and Corina Machado won an outright vote by 93%. So she is the clear candidate that everybody wants to stand against the current president. And interestingly, she's actually in favour of privatising PDVSA, which is the state-run oil company that was created back in the 1970s, which took a lot of assets off the oil majors. So she wants to move back to more of a capitalist society, whereby that oil company will be freely traded and therefore potentially could be more open and receptive to having more deals done and being able to sell oil to countries like the USA and into Europe. So this is a big step forward if she was to win power, for Venezuela actually re-entering the global oil markets and for having those sanctions removed. However, unfortunately, she's been banned from standing in the presidential election, despite the fact that she's the candidate that everybody wants to stand against Maduro. He's banned her and accused her of corruption and various fraud. Now, she's obviously denied all those allegations and said that these have been fabricated against her to prevent her from standing in the election. But as it stands at the moment, she is officially banned. Now, interestingly, Corina Machado put forward a replacement candidate who's also a female called Karina Yoris, just to confuse matters further. But unfortunately, the Venezuelan authorities said that she was too late to register for the presidential election. So she's also been excluded from any potential vote. So you can start to get a flavour as to why the USA isn't particularly impressed with Nicolas Maduro's handling of the presidential election. And the fact that he won't actually let anybody stand against him who's got a chance of winning really tells you that this election isn't likely to be fair and open, and therefore it's unlikely that Venezuela will have these sanctions lifted, and that's going to cause more problems for Venezuela, but also for the global oil supplies, because if Venezuela was able to sell freely into the open market, that would attract in investment from oil majors and could reinstate Venezuela as one of the biggest oil suppliers in the world. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because I think Venezuela is a really interesting country. It has the potential to be one of the biggest suppliers of oil globally. Admittedly, the oil that Venezuela has is more difficult to process. It's heavier and thicker and therefore takes more refining in terms of producing end user products. However, 300 billion barrels of oil is a huge amount of oil. And unfortunately, from Venezuela's point of view, as a result of its communist regime and the fact that it nationalised a lot of the overseas investment back in the 1970s, and then because of its political activities and some of the things that it's done over the last 10 years, it's been hit with sanctions which have prevented it from actually selling into the international markets. The combination of those two factors has really reduced the investment into the Venezuelan oil industry over the last 20 years. And as a result of that, Venezuela is not even in the top 20 in terms of production, despite having the largest potential reserves. So what this means from Venezuela's point of view is that there is so much untapped potential here. It could be a really affluent country, it could be doing really well, and it could be a big player on the global oil markets. But it isn't at the moment. And unfortunately, we've got a leader in place right now who doesn't want to have an open election. If he was happy to have a fair and open election process, then we would see all of those sanctions being lifted. We would see money pouring into Venezuela because there's still a lot of capital in the oil industry that's looking for drilling opportunities. So Venezuela does have the opportunity to turn things around. But unfortunately, that looks very unlikely. I don't think we're going to see the sort of election that the USA is hoping for in July 24. It's more likely that we will see Nicolas Maduro being voted back into power with a huge landslide victory. That isn't going to impress the USA or the European Union or all of the other countries that have applied sanctions against Venezuela. So it's likely that we will see the current situation continuing. What that means from Venezuela's point of view is that there won't be a large amount of investment going into the country. It's likely that we'll see a further aging and deterioration of the existing drilling facilities. So oil production is likely to go backwards in Venezuela over the next 6 to 12 months. That means that they'll be earning less income because the sanctions will also be preventing that oil from officially being sold all around the world. So Venezuela won't have the money to invest into the oil industry itself like it did in the 1990s. And so what we're likely to see is a vicious circle here where production continues to reduce, therefore exports reduce, therefore income reduces, therefore they can't invest further into the capital, and so production reduces, and so it goes on. So unfortunately from Venezuela's point of view, despite having massive potential, it's likely that the current dire situation is going to continue for the foreseeable future. The economy isn't going to get any better, and Venezuela isn't going to fix the supply problems that we have in the oil industry globally. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end, and here's something to put a smile on your face.